Victor Araujo had never been a man to look back. As the owner of a luxury hotel chain, his life was a succession of meetings, trips, and multi-million-dollar negotiations. At 38, he lived alone in an elegant downtown apartment and maintained brief relationships without any deep commitments. His routine was calculated to the extreme, and he liked it that way. Everything was under control, or so he thought until that rainy morning. The grey sky was reflected in the car's window as his driver took him to a routine inspection at one of his developments. He was reviewing emails on his cell phone when, at an intersection, his gaze fixed on a woman in worn clothes and disheveled hair, huddled against the wall of a building. Something about that silhouette seemed strangely familiar, and an unease arose in his chest. When the light turned green, Victor almost ignored the impulse to look again. But, for some reason, he asked the driver to stop. The fine rain drew trails on the woman's face, and her lost look conveyed a weariness that went beyond hunger or cold. He felt a lump in his throat when suddenly her features became clear. It was Laura Montero. The name echoed in his mind like an unexpected blow, the very name he hadn't uttered in over 20 years. The memory of the curly-haired girl with the radiant smile invaded his mind, brutally contrasting with the dejected woman before him. Childhood memories by her side flashed back. Afternoons running through the park, naive plans. For the future, the promise that they would never forget each other. But there she was, unrecognizable, living on the streets. Something inside him broke at that moment. Without thinking, Victor got out of the car, disregarding the umbrella his driver quickly opened. The cold water soaked his expensive suit, but he didn't care. He crossed the street with firm steps while uncertainty weighed in his chest. When he got closer, Laura shrank even further, as if she wanted to disappear. Her gaze quickly passed over his face, without showing immediate recognition. Her brown eyes, which had once shone with enthusiasm and joy, were now dull, as if carrying an invisible weight. "Laura!" he called, his voice almost failing. She blinked several times, trying to process the situation. Her expression wavered between surprise and embarrassment. Instinctively, she pulled the hood of her dirty coat over part of her face. "It's not me," she murmured, averting her eyes. But Victor knew. The initial shock gave way to a whirlwind of questions. How did she end up there? What had happened to her family? Why had he never heard from her again? He bent down to be at her level and spoke with the delicacy of someone treading on broken glass. "Laura, it's me, Victor." The name seemed to awaken something in her. Her chest heaved faster, and her thin, cold, trembling hands clutched the grimy fabric of her coat. Shame overflowed from every gesture. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice choked. "Go away." But Victor didn't move. He couldn't simply ignore that reality. The girl who once dreamed big alongside him was now there, hiding from the world. "I can help you," he insisted, keeping his voice calm yet firm. "Come with me." Laura laughed bitterly. "Help?" Her gaze met his, full of invisible scars. "No one can help me." Victor felt a tightening in his chest upon hearing those words. He had already dealt with complicated negotiations, closed multi-million-dollar deals, and faced fierce competitors, but nothing compared to what was before him now. Laura wasn't just someone from his past. She was a forgotten part of himself, a fragment of a time when he believed the world was simple and the promises made in childhood would last forever. Yet there, before him, was proof that life could be ruthless. He took a deep breath. "I won't insist," he said, changing his approach, "but at least come with me to have something to eat. You don't need anything more right now." He saw the hesitation in her eyes, an internal struggle between wounded pride and the hunger that had probably been gnawing at her for days. Laura pressed her lips together and averted her gaze, as if contemplating whether accepting help from someone who belonged to a world she no longer fit into was a mistake. After a long silence, she nodded almost imperceptibly. Without saying another word, she slowly got up, her movements heavy, as if she were carrying the weight of years of suffering on her shoulders. Victor guided her to the car, ignoring the curious looks of some passers-by. The driver opened the door hesitantly, probably finding the situation odd. Laura got in, keeping her gaze low, shrinking into the corner of the seat, as if she wanted to occupy the smallest space possible. The smell of rain mixed with the car's expensive perfume created a strange contrast with her wet, worn-out clothes. Victor sat beside her and gave the instruction, to the hotel. The driver didn't question, just pulled away. In the silence of the vehicle, Laura remained still, yet he noticed her fingers clenching the fabric of her coat, a small gesture that said so much. The journey to the hotel was quiet. Victor didn't try to start a conversation. He knew that Laura needed time. Her gaze was fixed on the window, following the raindrops sliding down the glass, as if trying to grasp something that made sense. Her rigid posture showed that she did not feel comfortable there, inside a luxurious car, feeling the air conditioning's warmth contrast with the cold that seemed to have settled within her long ago. When they finally arrived at the hotel, Laura hesitated before getting out. She looked at the imposing building before her, with its modern columns and gleaming glass facade. That was a distant world to which she no longer belonged, a world where she didn't feel welcome. "Let's go," said Victor, in a gentler tone than he was accustomed to using with people. She took a deep breath and got out of the car, automatically crossing her arms as if to protect herself. The hotel staff watched them discreetly, without questioning anything. One of them stepped forward to greet Victor, but he merely nodded and headed straight for the elevator, guiding Laura with him. When the doors closed, she let out a heavy sigh, almost a contained outburst. "You don't need to do this," she murmured. "I'm not doing it out of obligation," he replied, his gaze fixed on the ascending floor numbers on the panel. "I'm doing it because I want to." She laughed, but without humor. People want to help until they realize they can't fix what's broken. Victor didn't answer immediately. He just observed Laura from the corner of his eye, noticing the exhaustion etched in every line of her face. That wasn't the same girl he had known. Time, life, pain, everything had shaped her in an unrecognizable way. And yet he knew that somewhere inside her, the old Laura still existed. When the elevator reached the floor, he led her to one of the hotel's more discreet rooms. No extravagant suites or ostentatious decor, just a comfortable, quiet space, a refuge. He opened the door and stepped aside, letting her enter first. She hesitated, her eyes roaming the room as if she couldn't believe she was really there. With cautious steps, she crossed the room and touched the back of the sofa with her fingertips, as if needing to feel something real to convince herself it wasn't a dream. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said, closing the door behind him. Laura let out a weak laugh, shaking her head. "And then? What happens when I need to leave?" Victor crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "One thing at a time." He knew it was no use pressuring her with grand plans. First, she needed a warm shower, a decent meal, and a night's sleep without worrying about the next minute. But Laura didn't seem ready to accept any of that easily. She pulled the sleeves of her coat over her hands, a habit that reminded him of her childhood. "I'm not used to kindness," she confessed, her voice almost a whisper. "People don't do something like this without expecting something in return." Victor realized that arguing wouldn't help. Laura was accustomed to a world where every favor came with a price, where help never came without subsequent demands. He exhaled slowly and walked to the small table beside the sofa, where he left a key card. "You have your space. If you want to leave, leave. If you want to stay, stay. I'm not going to lock any doors or impose conditions." She frowned, suspicious, but said nothing. Instead, she sat slowly on the edge of the bed, as if her body could no longer support its own weight. She remained like that for a moment, motionless, until she ran her hands over her face, taking a deep breath. "The last time I slept in a real bed, I don't know," she murmured, almost to herself. Victor felt a lump in his throat but stayed resolute. "Do you want something to eat?" he asked. She shook her head. Later, her eyes began to droop, and he realized that in that moment exhaustion was stronger than hunger. "Then rest," he said, walking to the door. Before leaving, he looked back and saw her with her eyes closed, yet the tension still evident in her expression. It wouldn't be simple. Nothing about this would be simple, but he did not intend to give up. The night fell silently over the city, and Victor remained in his office inside the hotel, pretending to work while his mind wandered to Laura. He knew he couldn't force her to accept help, but he also couldn't ignore the brutal reality of her situation. He decided to give her space, at least for that night. Deep down, he hoped that when she woke, Laura might see a glimmer of hope in what he was offering. When he finally put aside the papers and left the office, he went straight to the room where he had left her. He stopped before the door for a moment, hesitant. He didn't want to startle her or seem invasive, so he knocked softly. No answer. He hesitated before turning the knob. The door opened without resistance, and the room was plunged into semi-darkness. Laura was sleeping deeply, curled up on the sheets as if trying to make herself smaller. Her breathing was slow and rhythmic, and for a moment, Victor felt a subtle relief. Perhaps that was the first night in years that she slept without fear of being expelled from some cold corner of the city. He backed away, carefully closing the door. As he walked down the corridor, he realized that this would be a difficult journey. Laura wasn't just a homeless woman. She was a woman who had lost everything, even the belief that she deserved a new start. The next morning, Victor woke early and went down to have breakfast in the hotel's restaurant. The dining room was quiet at that hour, occupied only by a few solitary guests and hurrying executives. He ordered a strong coffee and a fruit plate, but in truth, his attention was fixed on the elevator. He wanted to see if Laura would come out on her own or remain hidden, afraid to occupy a space she no longer believed was hers. Minutes later, when he was about to consider going up to check on her, he spotted her hesitantly at the restaurant's entrance. Her hair, now clean, fell loosely on her shoulders, and the oversized clothes he had left in the room seemed uncomfortable on her, as if she were still carrying the weight of the rags she wore on the street. Laura stayed there for a while, analyzing the surroundings, as if afraid of being expelled at any moment. When she noticed Victor, her eyes automatically looked away, but she did not retreat. Instead, she took a deep breath and walked to a table further away. He saw that as a sign, not an explicit cry for help, but a small concession, a gesture that perhaps she was willing to at least try. He got up unhurriedly and went to her, pulling out the chair in front of her. "Good morning," he said, placing his cup on the table. Laura slowly looked up, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the napkin. "I haven't decided if it's a good morning yet," she replied in a dry tone, but without hostility. Victor gave a half smile. "How about starting with a coffee?" Laura hesitated for a moment before picking up the menu. Her fingers slid slowly over the plastic-covered pages, as if trying to remember how it felt to choose something for herself. But soon she closed the menu and rested her hands on the table. "I don't know how to do this anymore," she confessed in a low, almost embarrassed tone. Victor didn't need to ask what she meant. He could see in her eyes the weight of years without choices, of accepting whatever life threw her way. "Then let me choose for you," he said, calling a waiter. He ordered a café comme latte, toast, and an orange juice. Simple, nothing that seemed excessive. When the order arrived, Laura stared at the steaming cup for a long time before finally grasping it with both hands and taking a sip. The warmth of the coffee seemed to thaw something inside her. Her shoulders relaxed a little, and for a moment she just drank, without worrying if anyone was watching. Victor said nothing, just waited. When she finished the toast, she leaned back in the chair and stared at the empty cup. "You want to know how I got here?" she said bluntly. He nodded slightly. He didn't need to press her, but he wouldn't pretend he didn't want to understand. Laura sighed and ran her hand over her face. "It's going to be a long story." Victor crossed his arms over the table. "I have time." For the first time, her lips curved into a weak smile, laden with weariness. Then I hope you have patience too. Laura diverted her gaze to the window as she gathered her thoughts. It wasn't easy to put into words everything she had experienced over the years. Victor noticed this and waited, without interrupting. When she finally began to speak, her voice had a distant tone, as if she were reliving every scene instead of merely recounting it. It all started when my father lost his job, she said, fidgeting with the napkin. He had worked for years at the same company, but one day came the news of mass layoffs. My mother tried to hold things together, sewing and taking on odd jobs, but the bills began to pile up. She paused for a moment, pressing her lips together before continuing. We lost our apartment, and we had to move in with relatives as a favor. I thought it was temporary, that things would get better, but then my mother fell ill. Her mother's name was spoken with a lump in her throat. Victor saw how her fingers gripped the edge of the table, her breathing slightly quickened. We didn't have money for proper treatment. The public health system helped as best it could, but there were queues, delays, bureaucracy. She worsened quickly. Her voice trembled in the last sentence, but there were no tears. It was a dry lament, like someone who had cried so much that only emptiness was left. When she died, my father fell apart. He was never a weak man, you know, but he was in love with her, depended on her. At first, he drank to forget. Later, he drank because he no longer knew how else to live. Laura let out a short, bitter laugh. And then, one day, he went out to buy another bottle and never came back. Victor remained silent, absorbing every word. He knew that Laura wasn't seeking compassion or pity. She wasn't the kind of person she used to be, but she wasn't the same in person either. And you ended up alone? He asked, his voice controlled but full of concern. Laura nodded slowly. For a while, I tried to stay with relatives, but it didn't take long to become clear that I was a burden. They never said it directly, but you could feel it. The looks, the insinuations, the whispered conversations when I left the room. She fiddled with the sleeve of her coat, an automatic gesture that revealed her anxiety. One day, a cousin suggested that I find shelter. She said that perhaps it would be better for everyone. I understood what she really meant. That memory still weighed on Laura, and Victor saw it in her eyes. So you left, he completed. She let out a long sigh. I grabbed some clothes, a few coins I had, and left. At first I stayed in shelters, but they were temporary, overcrowded, and I never felt truly safe. She paused for a moment, as if choosing the right words. And then, when you're on the street long enough, you realize that the world has no patience for you. People look away, pretend you don't exist. At first it hurts, then you learn to do the same. Victor felt a weight in his chest as he listened to her say that. For Laura, survival meant becoming invisible. And now, there she sat before him, for the first time in a long while, allowing herself to be seen. Victor took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the moment. Laura's story wasn't just a succession of misfortunes. It was a slow and painful deconstruction of who she once was. Did you try asking for help? He asked, knowing the answer wouldn't be simple. Laura laughed without humor and rested her elbows on the table. Of course, but asking for help when you're on the street doesn't work the way people think. You can't just knock on someone's door and say, "Hey, I lost everything, can you give me a chance?" People don't trust you. They think that if you're on the street, you must have done something to deserve it. She diverted her gaze to the window, watching the city's movement outside. So you learn not to ask. You learn to accept leftovers, to sleep wherever you can, to ignore fear because no one cares if you're scared. Victor couldn't help but imagine what it must have been like for her. Someone he remembered as a lively little girl, to become that woman who told her own story as if recounting someone else's life. But you survived, he said, and Laura let out a tired sigh. Yes, but at what cost? She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on his. I learned to survive, but I unlearned everything I was. I don't know how to be anyone other than that anymore. Her voice faltered on the last word, and for the first time, Victor saw a flash of vulnerability she tried to hide. He fought the impulse to tell her she could start over. It wasn't a phrase one said to someone who had heard it so many times with nothing changing. Laura ran her hand over her face, as if trying to brush away the weight of that conversation. Victor respected her silence, waiting for her to continue in her own time. After a few seconds, she resumed, her voice lower. "I thought I'd reached the worst, but I was wrong." She swallowed hard before proceeding. "It was when I met Marcos." The name came out with a bitter taste, and Victor immediately realized that this part of the story was different. He seemed like a good person at first. He offered me shelter, food. He said he'd help me get out of that situation. She laughed, a short, lifeless laugh. "But everything has a price, right?" Victor felt his jaw tense. He knew exactly what would come next. "Did he hurt you?" he asked bluntly. Laura averted her gaze and shook her head, but did not deny it. "Not like you're thinking," she replied, her tone making it clear that the truth was too complex for a simple answer. "He made me believe that I owed him something, that because he helped me, I needed to be grateful, submissive," she sighed. "And I believed him, because after so long of being ignored, any crumb of attention seems like a gift." Laura closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to push away the memories. "We were together for a while, and that's when I found out I was pregnant." The word hung in the air for a moment, laden with meanings that Laura didn't even need to explain. Victor noticed that her fists tightened on the table, as if she were bracing for an invisible blow. "And what did he do when he found out?" he asked, even though he already sensed the answer. Laura let out a dry laugh. "He vanished." She fiddled with the napkin, tearing it into little pieces without realizing it. "In the first week, he pretended everything was fine, but you could see the annoyance in his eyes. In the second, he started saying that I had to fix it. In the third, he disappeared." Victor felt his anger rise inside him, but he kept a neutral expression. He knew that Laura didn't need indignation, she needed to be heard. "And you were alone again," he said, and she nodded, her eyes fixed on the table. This time, it was worse. It wasn't just about me. There was a life growing inside me, and I had no idea what to do. She took a deep breath before continuing. "I spent months trying to find a way out, but every door I knocked on was closed. I had no job, no home, no one. With each passing day, my belly grew, and so did the fear." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to stop herself from reliving those months of uncertainty. "When Sophia was born, I already knew I wouldn't be able to take care of her, but knowing didn't make the decision any easier." Laura fell silent for a moment, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I didn't want to give her up," she said, her voice choked, "but I had no choice. I couldn't give her what a child needs, a roof, food, security, love perhaps, but love alone doesn't sustain anyone." She diverted her gaze to the window, as if searching for an escape in the landscape outside. "When I went to the adoption system, they told me that there were couples waiting for years for an opportunity, people who could give her everything I never could." Victor realized that this was the deepest wound. More than losing her home, more than being abandoned, more than the hunger and the cold. The decision to give Sophia to another family was a burden Laura carried every day. "It was quick," she continued, her eyes fixed on the empty cup. "I signed the papers, gave her one last kiss, and left before I could change my mind." Her voice faltered, and for a moment she seemed fragile, small, as if she were still in that white hospital corridor, watching her daughter being carried away by unfamiliar arms. "I never saw her again. I never saw her face again, and I learned to live without asking if she was okay." Victor felt a tightening in his chest as he listened to those words. He tried to imagine what it meant to carry that absence every day, waking up knowing that a piece of you was somewhere in the world, yet unreachable. "And you never tried to look for her?" he asked without judgment, just curiosity. Laura let out a heavy sigh. "I couldn't. The system in which she was adopted doesn't allow contact. It was a closed adoption, with no loopholes. What I knew was enough to make me move on, or at least try." She rubbed her temples, as if trying to push away the pain that resurfaced with every word. I thought that if she were in a loving home, if she had parents who could care for her, then the best I could do was disappear. Victor understood that Laura was trying to convince herself of something she had never truly been able to accept. But now it doesn't have to be that way, he said, choosing his words carefully. We can try to find her. Laura looked up, her eyes wide, as if that possibility had never really crossed her mind. Find her. Her voice came out in a mix of hope and fear. Victor, I'm nobody. What would I say to her? How could I enter her life without destroying everything she knows? He leaned slightly forward. You are her mother, Laura, and if there's a chance to rebuild that connection, why not try? For a moment, she didn't answer. She just took a deep breath, and for the first time, he saw something different in her gaze than pain, a spark of hope. Laura lowered her head, running her hands over her face as if trying to organize her thoughts. It was obvious that the idea of finding Sophia shook her deeply, but Victor knew that deep down she wanted that. And if she hates me, she murmured almost to herself, what if she thinks I abandoned her because I didn't want her? Her voice trembled, laden with genuine fear. Victor waited for her to look at him again before answering. The only way to know is to try. Laura let out a weak, nervous laugh. You talk as if it was simple. Victor leaned a little forward, resting his arms on the table. No, it's not simple, but you've been through things that would have destroyed anyone, and you're still here. He kept his gaze fixed on hers. If there's even the smallest chance for you to find Sophia and explain the truth, it's worth trying. Laura fell silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on the table. It was clear that an internal conflict was unfolding within her. When she finally spoke, her voice was hesitant but determined. If I do this, will you help me? Victor didn't need a second to answer. I'm already helping. In the following days, Victor set everything in motion necessary to find Sophia. He used his contacts, hired a private investigator, and combed through records until he found a concrete lead. Meanwhile, Laura seemed to live in a limbo between anxiety and doubt. Sometimes he would find her sitting in the hotel room, staring into nothingness, lost in thoughts he couldn't decipher. Other times, he noticed that she avoided talking about the subject as if afraid that any expectation would turn into frustration. Then, on a cold afternoon, while they were in the hotel lobby, Victor's phone rang. He answered quickly and listened to the words that would change everything. We found Sophia. The investigator relayed the essential information. The girl was living with her adoptive parents, Clara and Eduardo, in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a stable, loving family. Laura listened without blinking, gripping her own hands tightly. And now? She asked, her voice almost inaudible. Victor looked at her seriously. Now we do it the right way. The next day, Victor and Laura went to the neighborhood where Sophia lived. The car parked across the street, and from there they could see the house, a modest two-story home with a well-kept garden and toys scattered in the yard. Laura held the strap of her blouse so tightly that her knuckles went white. She's over there, she murmured, more to herself than to Victor. He observed her profile and saw the fear etched in every detail. Do you want to go over there? He asked cautiously. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment before answering. Not like this. Not without knowing how they're going to react. Victor agreed. The approach needed to be careful. He got out of the car and walked to the door, leaving Laura hidden inside the vehicle. He rang the doorbell and waited, his heart beating fast. Seconds later, a woman opened the door. Clara, gentle eyes, a tentative smile, as if she were not used to receiving unexpected visitors. Can I help you? Victor introduced himself and explained the situation as delicately as possible. Clara said nothing for a long time, absorbing the information. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but firm. Sophia is my daughter, she said without hostility, only protectiveness. I understand, Victor replied calmly, but Laura doesn't want to take her away from you. She only wants to know if she's okay. Clara remained silent for a few moments, analyzing Victor with attentive eyes. He realized that despite the surprise, she did not show fear or repulsion, only a deep need to protect Sophia. "She's okay," she said at last. "She's a happy girl, full of energy. I don't know what Laura's life was like, but I know that whatever decision she made, it was made out of love." Victor nodded. Laura never wanted to abandon her, she just had no choice. Clara lowered her gaze slightly as if pondering something. "And what does she want now?" Victor maintained his calm tone, unhurried. "She only wants to see her. She won't impose on your lives. Doesn't want to change anything, but she needs to know with her own eyes that Sophia is well." Clara took a deep breath and looked inside the house for a moment. "I need to talk to Eduardo," she said in a cautious tone. "Sophia is our daughter, and everything we do is for her." Victor completely understood. "Of course, and Laura will wait for what you decide." Clara pressed her lips together, still hesitant, but something in her eyes said that deep down she already knew what the answer would be. That afternoon, Laura and Victor went to a park where Clara and Eduardo usually took Sophia to play. The meeting had been arranged carefully. No sudden revelations or discussions about the past. It was to be a discreet first contact, just so Laura could see her daughter up close. While waiting on one of the benches near the playground, Laura fidgeted nervously with her fingers, her gaze restless. "What if she doesn't like me?" she murmured. Victor gently touched her hand, trying to calm her. "She doesn't need to like you right away. She just needs to get to know you." Minutes later, Clara and Eduardo arrived. Sophia ran ahead of them excitedly, holding a doll in a blue dress. Her brown hair swayed as she jumped on the grass, completely unaware of what was happening around her. Laura held her breath upon seeing her. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked quickly to hold them back. "She's beautiful," she whispered. Clara smiled kindly. "And very smart." Sophia finally stopped near them, looking at Laura with the genuine curiosity of a child meeting someone new. "Hi," the girl said with a shy smile. Laura opened her mouth, but her voice failed for the first second. Then she took a deep breath and answered, "Hi, Sophia." Sophia looked at Laura with the genuine curiosity of a child meeting someone new. "Do you know my mother?" she asked, pointing to Clara. Laura exchanged a quick glance with her before answering. "Sort of. Your dad and your mum told me that you like to play here." Sophia nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, I love the swing. Have you ever played on a swing?" Laura smiled, feeling her heart race with the simplicity of the conversation. "Yes, when I was a child, but it's been a long time." Sophia frowned as if trying to imagine a little Laura. "So you must have liked it a lot." Before Laura could answer, the girl naturally took her hand. "Do you want to push the swing for me?" The touch made Laura hold her breath. It was such a spontaneous, innocent gesture that, for a moment, she forgot everything. The fear, the guilt, the uncertainty. She just smiled and nodded. "Of course, Sophia. Let's go." As they walked together to the playground, Victor and Clara exchanged a knowing look. The connection forming between mother and daughter was so natural that no one there could deny that something special was happening. Laura began by pushing the swing slowly at first, still absorbing the feeling of being so close to Sophia. The little girl giggled with each stronger push, throwing her head back and closing her eyes, enjoying the wind on her face. "Higher," she requested between laughs. Laura obliged, and for a moment she forgot everything. She forgot the hard years, the weight of the past, the fear of the future. In that moment, there was only Sophia laughing and the genuine joy of seeing her happy. When the swinging slowed, Sophia jumped to the ground and looked at Laura with curiosity. "Do you have children?" The question caught Laura off guard, but she maintained a gentle expression. "No, only nieces and nephews, but I really like children." Sophia smiled and picked up her doll from the bench. "Then can you play with me?" Laura hesitated, surprised at how easily the girl accepted her. "I can," she replied, her throat tightening. In the distance, Clara watched everything closely. Perhaps she, too, was beginning to see that this meeting wasn't just any moment. It was the beginning of something greater. Laura sat on the grass beside Sophia, helping her arrange the doll's little accessories. The girl talked non-stop, inventing stories about her plastic daughter and how she had to eat soup to grow strong. Laura listened attentively, enchanted by every detail. It was as if Sophia was unknowingly offering her small windows into the life that had brought her here. The gestures, the expressions, the way she wrinkled her nose when inventing something. Everything about her seemed both familiar and surprising. On the other side of the park, Clara and Eduardo observed the scene. Eduardo, who until then had remained more reserved, let out a sigh before saying, "She seems to get along well with Laura." Clara nodded slowly. "Yes, I didn't know what to expect, but I never imagined it would be so natural." They exchanged looks, sharing the same silent concern. "And now?" Eduardo asked. Clara kept her eyes on Sophia and Laura, who were now laughing together about something trivial. "Now, we see where this leads." The meetings at the park became frequent. Sophia began to wait eagerly for Laura, running up to her as soon as she arrived. The bond between them grew naturally, without the girl knowing the full truth. For Laura, every moment by her daughter's side was a gift, but also a silent torture. She wanted more. She wanted to embrace her without fear, to be able to call her daughter. But she knew that decision wasn't hers alone. One afternoon, while Sophia was playing on the swing, Clara approached Laura and sat beside her on the bench. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the girl. "She likes you," Clara said, without beating around the bush. Laura smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I know, and that scares me." Clara turned to look at her. "Why?" Laura took a deep breath. "Because I'm afraid of what will happen when she finds out who I am." Clara pondered her words before answering. "She's an intelligent girl with a huge heart. I don't think she'll reject you." Laura lowered her head. "And if she does, what if she hates me for leaving her?" Clara gently held her hand. "There's only one way to find out." Laura felt the weight of Clara's words, but she still wasn't sure if she was ready to take that risk. The fear of rejection was overwhelming. However, fate wouldn't give her much time to hesitate. Days later, while they were playing in the park, Sophia suddenly stopped and looked at Laura with a curious expression. "You look like me," she said, frowning. Laura felt her heart race, but stayed calm. "Really?" She tried to deflect, but Sophia nodded. "Yes, the way your smile is, and you have a little dimple here." She pointed to Laura's cheek. "Just like mine." Clara and Eduardo, who were nearby, exchanged glances. That was the first time Sophia noticed something that would inevitably lead her to question her own story. Laura swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. However, Sophia didn't seem satisfied. "Have you known my parents for a long time?" she asked, her eyes attentive. Laura quickly looked at Clara, who maintained a serene expression, as if letting her decide what to do. The moment she had feared had arrived, and there was no escape. "Yes," she replied, her voice softer than she imagined. "I've known your parents, and I've known you since you were born." Sophia frowned even more, confused. "Since I was born," she repeated, trying to understand. The girl blinked several times, her young mind processing the information. Laura felt a lump in her throat as she realized that Sophia was about to understand what that meant. Sophia looked from Laura to Clara, then back to Laura. Her small face showed a mix of curiosity and confusion. "But how do you know me since I was born?" The question lingered in the air, laden with a weight a child her age shouldn't have to carry. Laura felt her stomach turn. This was the moment she both feared and longed for. Clara, beside her, remained silent, allowing Laura to lead the revelation. Taking a deep breath, Laura bent down to be at the girl's level and spoke gently. "Because I'm your mother." Sophia blinked quickly as if expecting someone to contradict that. "My mother?" she repeated, looking to Clara for confirmation. Clara nodded slightly, her eyes shining with contained emotion. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Sophia didn't cry, didn't run, didn't pull away. She just stayed there, looking at Laura, trying to piece together the puzzle. "But my mother is the mommy," she said, pointing to Clara, her voice wavering. between reason and childlike instinct. And she is, Clara replied calmly. But Laura is too. Sophia furrowed her brows, her little mind trying to grasp something so enormous. Laura swallowed the pain and continued, I loved you from the day you were born, but I couldn't care for you the way you deserved. So your mother and your father gave you everything I couldn't. Sophia remained silent for a moment, then looked into Laura's eyes, absorbing every word. You left me because you loved me. The innocence in that question made Laura feel a lump in her throat. Tears welled in Laura's eyes, but she didn't want to cry, not at that moment. Sophia didn't need to see sadness. She needed to hear the truth. Yes, Sophia, she replied, her voice firm yet laden with emotion. I never wanted to leave you, but I didn't have a home. I couldn't give you food, nor protect you the way you deserved. And I loved you so much that I chose what was best for you, even if it meant not being with you. Sophia fell silent for a few seconds, her gaze profound for a child her age. And now? She asked, in an almost hesitant tone. Now you want to stay with me? The question caught Laura by surprise. Her instinct screamed yes. She longed to hold her in her arms and never let her go. But she knew things didn't work that way. Laura looked at Clara and Eduardo before answering. She didn't want to rush anything, didn't want Sophia to feel that her family was threatened. What I want most in the world is to be near you, she said, gently holding the little girl's hands. But it has to be the way you want, the way your parents think is best. Sophia looked at Clara and Eduardo, seeking their support, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a need to understand. Clara knelt down and smoothed her daughter's hair. Nothing will change overnight, my dear. You have time to feel whatever you need, to understand all of this. Sophia turned her gaze back to Laura. Will you keep coming to play with me? The little girl asked in a small, almost timid voice. Laura smiled through teary eyes. I will, whenever you want. Laura's answer seemed to satisfy Sophia, who let out a relieved sigh and smiled softly. It was as if her little heart still didn't fully grasp all the layers of that revelation, but somehow felt safe. For her part, Laura felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She didn't know what would happen from then on, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel that she was just surviving. She felt that she had a purpose, a reason to go on. Victor, watching the scene from a distance, felt a silent pride grow within him. Not for having helped Laura, but for seeing the strength she had within herself. He knew she was capable of rebuilding her life, and now she was beginning to believe it too. In the following days, Laura and Sophia continued to meet regularly. The bond between them grew with each day, unhurried but natural. Clara and Eduardo, attentive to everything, noticed that there was no resistance from their daughter, only growing curiosity and an affection that effortlessly strengthened. But while everything seemed to be moving toward a new phase of hope, a ghost from the past returned to haunt Laura. On a rainy night, after a long day, she received an unexpected message on the phone Victor had given her. An unknown number. Her heart raced even before reading the words. I know about Sophia. We need to talk. There was no name, but Laura knew immediately who it was. Marcos. Laura felt her blood run cold. For a moment, the world around her seemed to lose its sound, and all that remained was the rapid pulsing in her ears. Marcos. The name she had buried in the past now resurfaced, bringing with it everything she feared most. Her hands trembled as she clutched the cell phone. How did he find out? What did he want? Victor, who was beside her on the hotel sofa, noticed her expression and frowned. What's wrong? Laura hesitated for a second before showing him the screen. As soon as he read the message, Victor's expression turned somber. He wants money, he said bluntly, or he wants to hurt you in some way. Laura swallowed hard, trying to control the rising fear. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice a thread of despair. If he really wants to get involved, he has legal rights, doesn't he? Victor closed his eyes for a moment, weighing the possibilities. He might try, but he has no connection to Sophia. He never registered her, never showed any interest. But Laura knew Marcos wasn't the type to give up easily. And if he wants to destroy everything I've built with her, if he tells Sophia in the worst possible way, if he tries to make me look like the villain, Victor squeezed her hand firmly. Then we face him together. Laura wanted to believe Victor's words, but she knew Marcos wasn't a problem that could simply be ignored. He was manipulative, knew how to twist the truth into something distorted. The very thought of him approaching Sophia made her nauseous. "And what if he goes to Clara and Eduardo?" she asked, her voice trembling. "If he wants to mess everything up just to prove he still has control over me?" Victor pressed his lips together, thoughtful. "We won't let him do that, but we need to act before he has time to try anything." The next morning, Victor contacted his lawyers to analyze the legal situation. Meanwhile, a nervous Laura decided to take the initiative and speak directly with Clara and Eduardo. She didn't want them to hear it from someone else. As soon as she sat down with them to talk, she felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. "Marcos got in touch with me," she said bluntly. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "He wants Sophia." Laura swallowed hard. "I'm not sure, but he never cared before. If he's after her now, it's because he wants something." Eduardo folded his arms, worried. "Whatever it is, we won't let him hurt Sophia." The firmness in his voice gave Laura a momentary relief. She wasn't alone. The threat of Marcos loomed over everyone, like a storm about to break. With the support of Victor and Sophia's adoptive parents, Laura prepared for the worst. Days later, Marcos finally reappeared. He arranged a meeting at a secluded cafe, and even though Laura was apprehensive, she decided to go accompanied by Victor. When she arrived, she found the man who had once promised her a future, and then disappeared without looking back. He didn't seem remorseful. His smile was that of someone who knew he had power over the situation. "It's been a while, Laura," he said casually, fiddling with the coffee in front of him. "Just say what you want, Marcos," she retorted, without any patience for games. He leaned over the table, his eyes narrowed, assessing her. "I found out that you found our daughter," he said, as if he had some right over Sophia. Laura felt her blood boil. "She was never our daughter. You abandoned her before even meeting her." Marcos smiled, slyly, as if expecting that response. "And yet she is my biological daughter. You know what that means, right?" Laura clenched her fists under the table, but before she could answer, Victor intervened. "It means that, legally, you have no rights over her," he said, his voice firm and controlled. "You never registered her. You never cared if she was alive." Marcos glared at Victor, and something in his eyes indicated that he didn't like being challenged. "Then perhaps I should take it to court," he threatened. "After all, a judge might see it differently." Laura felt a chill down her spine, but did not show weakness. "You don't want Sophia," she said, keeping her gaze fixed on Marcos. "You want money. You want to blackmail me." Marcos smirked derisively. "And if I do, you can pay to make me disappear, or you can risk seeing if I can claim any rights over her." Rage flared inside Laura like a wildfire, but she held her ground. "I'm not gonna give you a penny." Victor, standing by her, sighed, folded his arms. "And you can try anything you want, Marcos, but know that we already have lawyers ready for you." Marcos's smile wavered slightly, but he wasn't ready to give up so easily. "We'll see then." He stood up, adjusting his coat with an irritating air of superiority. "Good luck with your little daughter. I hope she understands when she finds out that her mother hid the truth." Laura felt her heart tighten, but she did not react. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. As soon as Marcos left the cafe, Victor took her hand. "He's bluffing," he assured. "He might try, but he doesn't stand a chance." Laura closed her eyes for a second, taking a deep breath. "I can't let him destroy everything." Victor squeezed her hand firmly. "He won't. He doesn't have any power over you, not anymore." The following days were tense. Laura couldn't shake the fear that Marcos would carry out his threat, yet she didn't want to live under his control again. Then Victor proposed something she hadn't expected. "Let's go to court first," he suggested. "If we file an official request to ensure he has no access to Sophia, we cut off any chance for him to use that against you." The idea was frightening, but it made sense. Laura hesitated, but deep down she knew it was the only way to protect her daughter. With the support of Victor's lawyers and Clara and Eduardo, they initiated the process. Meanwhile, Laura decided to tell Sophia the full truth. She didn't want her daughter to hear another version from Marcos. She chose a quiet afternoon, sat next to the girl, and calmly explained everything. She recounted her past, the hardships she had faced, the decision she had to make. Sophia listened intently, clutching her doll tightly. When Laura finished, the girl was silent for a moment, then smiled and came closer, hugging her tightly. "I like you, Laura," she said, in a small but sincere voice, "and I'm never going to leave you again." Sophia's words resonated in Laura's heart in a way she had never imagined possible. That embrace was proof that, regardless of the past, the present still offered a chance to rebuild what had been lost. Clara and Eduardo were nearby, watching the scene with emotion. They knew this was a moment that would change everything, not just for Sophia, but for all of them. "You will always have a family," Clara said with a warm smile. "And that family can be bigger than we imagined." Eduardo nodded, adding, "The important thing is that Sophia grows up surrounded by love." The legal battle against Marcos was resolved faster than Laura had expected. He had no legal grounds to claim anything, and his history of abandonment and lack of involvement worked against him. The threat dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, and for the first time in a long time, Laura felt that she could breathe without fear. But what truly surprised her was realizing that even after everything, something inside her was being reborn. Victor's look at her was different now. Not just that of a man who wanted to help her, but someone who saw in her something that perhaps she was still discovering. Months later, on a sunny afternoon in the same park where it all began, Laura watched Sophia running across the lawn, laughing freely. For the first time, she felt whole, not only because she had regained her daughter, but because amid the chaos, she had rediscovered herself. Victor approached and sat beside her on the bench, holding her hand. Without a word. It wasn't necessary. They had weathered a storm, and now finally the sun was shining. "So," he said after a while, "ready for a new beginning?" Laura smiled, feeling the weight of the past gradually dissipate. "I think so." Sophia ran over to them and, without hesitation, jumped into Laura's arms, holding her as if she were never going to let go, and she never would.